Are you going to turn me in to the police? I was almost arrested after discovering that my grandson was hiding drugs in my car. My name is Joaquim. I'm 68 years old, and every brick I ever laid in this life was done with my own hands. I've worked as a bricklayer since I was barely out of my teens, and through sunburnt summers, bone-chilling winters, and more sore backs than I can count, I built not only houses, but a life I could be proud of. My wife passed away when our daughter Helena was still very young. From that day on, I wore two hats, father and mother, doing everything I could to raise her right. I didn't have much, but I made sure she had what mattered: a roof over her head, food on the table, and values she could carry with her for the rest of her life. I always told Helena that life wouldn't hand her anything. You had to earn your place in the world with hard work and integrity. And for a while, it seemed like she understood that. She studied, became independent, and eventually had a child of her own. When she told me she was going to raise her son, Lucas, in a more modern way, less discipline, more freedom, I had my doubts. I kept them to myself, though. After all, she was an adult now, and I didn't want to come off as the stubborn old man who thinks his way is the only way. So I stayed in my lane. But even as I bit my tongue, I could see the difference. Lucas was a good boy, at least at first. Bright, curious, full of energy. But he didn't have limits. Every time he acted out, Helena made excuses. "He's just expressing himself," she'd say. "You're too strict, Dad. Times are different now." I tried to believe her. I told myself the world had changed, and maybe I was the one who needed to adapt. Still, something deep down kept gnawing at me, a feeling that too much freedom without responsibility would lead to trouble. Years passed, and I remained involved in their lives. I'd help with repairs around the house, give Lucas rides to school, buy groceries when money was tight. I wasn't just a grandfather, I was a second parent. But the older Lucas got, the more distant he became. He stopped saying thank you, stopped looking me in the eyes. He got secretive, moody, and short-tempered. Helena didn't seem worried, or maybe she just didn't want to admit something was wrong. To her, he was still her sweet little boy, and to suggest otherwise was to accuse her of failing as a mother. Then came the day that changed everything. It started like any other morning. I went out to run some errands, using my old pickup truck like always. But when I stopped at the corner store and popped open the glove box looking for some spare change, I found something I wasn't supposed to. A plastic bag, white powder, a smell I didn't recognize but didn't need to. I knew what I was looking at. My heart sank. My hands trembled. In that moment, the world stood still. That was the first crack. The moment I realized my quiet suspicions had roots, and as much as I wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation, I knew in my bones this was the beginning of something much darker. When Helena told me that she needed to travel for work and asked if Lucas, her 19-year-old son, could stay at my house for a few weeks, I didn't hesitate. I've always loved my grandson, even though I never truly understood the way he was being raised. He had grown up without responsibilities, never hearing the word no and believing that the world owed him something. I had tried, gently, to warn Helena that life doesn't work like that, but every time I brought it up, she'd dismiss me with a smile and say, "Times have changed, Dad." So I stayed quiet and hoped she was right. But deep down, something about Lucas's arrogance always bothered me. The first days were peaceful. Lucas spent most of his time in his room, glued to his phone, barely talking to me. He'd come down to eat, mumble a few words, and disappear again. I didn't mind. Teenagers are like that, I thought. At least he was quiet. I kept to my routine, waking up early, tending the small garden behind the house, and doing a bit of repair work here and there, just to keep my hands busy. I offered to teach him some of what I knew, even basic things, how to fix a leaky faucet, how to patch a wall. But he laughed it off. "That's not for me, Grandpa," he said. "I'm gonna be rich one day, you'll see." I smiled, but I couldn't help feeling a little uneasy. One evening, I walked past his room and caught a strange smell. Not quite cigarette smoke, but something different, sweet and pungent. I paused at the door, hesitated, and then knocked. He answered a moment later, eyes red and half-lidded, his voice slow. "What's up, Grandpa?" I didn't say anything then. Maybe I should have. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, or maybe he was just tired. I didn't want to cause conflict. Not yet. I'd give it time, watch him more closely. But a shadow of doubt had already been planted in my heart, and it wouldn't go away. Later that week, I noticed him going out late at night. He'd slip out quietly, thinking I was asleep, and come back hours later. One time I heard a car honk outside, and when I peeked through the curtains, I saw him getting into a vehicle with 2 other boys. They didn't look like trouble, just young guys, maybe friends. Still, something about it felt off. I reminded myself that I had promised to give him space, to respect the way Helena chose to raise him. But what if something was wrong? What if this wasn't just harmless teenage behavior? Then came the moment that made my heart sink. I went to drive to the market one morning, like I always did on Saturdays. When I opened the trunk of my car to load some tools, I saw a bag, small, black, and heavy. Curious, I opened it. Inside were several smaller bags, tightly sealed, filled with something white and powdery. My hands trembled. I knew what it was. I had seen enough news reports to recognize the signs. I closed the trunk slowly, heart pounding, and walked back inside the house, unsure of what to do. My whole world had shifted in a second, and I knew this was only the beginning. It all started with little things. At first, I thought it was just my age playing tricks on me. A strange smell in the back seat, some ash on the floor mat, a few friends of Lucas that seemed too nervous, too edgy when they saw me. I brushed it off. Maybe I was just being too suspicious. But then I began to notice how often Lucas asked to borrow my car. At first it was once or twice a week, saying he needed to go to school or hang out with friends. Then it became almost daily. And every time he had a new excuse, a new story, a new smile. I didn't want to believe anything bad. I wanted to trust my grandson, but a part of me knew something was wrong. One morning, after Lucas had taken the car again the night before, I found a small plastic bag under the front passenger seat. It had some white powder inside, barely noticeable. I froze. My heart beat faster than it had in years. I'd seen things like that on the news. I knew exactly what it looked like. I didn't touch it. I wrapped it in paper, took it inside, and sat at the kitchen table staring at it for over an hour. Could my grandson really? I waited until Helena came home from work and showed it to her. Her reaction shocked me more than the discovery itself. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't even look surprised. She just sighed, took the bag from my hands, and tossed it into the trash can like it was nothing. "Don't make a big deal out of it, Dad," she said. "Kids experiment with stuff. It doesn't mean he's a criminal." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I raised my voice, asked her how long she had known, and she told me not to yell. She told me I was old-fashioned, that I didn't understand how kids are these days. That was the first time in years I felt truly powerless. Not because of my body or my age, but because I realized my own daughter wouldn't stand by my side. From that day on, I started watching Lucas closer. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed to know. I began checking the car after he used it, paying attention to who picked him up, who dropped him off. I started noticing patterns. Sometimes he'd come home late, eyes red, hands shaking. Other times he'd bring home sneakers and phones that I knew he couldn't afford. I asked questions, and he always had an answer, too quick, too perfect. He looked me in the eyes and lied with the same face I used to see when he was 5 years old and broke a window with a soccer ball. Except now it wasn't a window, it was my peace, my trust. Still, I didn't go to the police, not yet. I kept it all to myself, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I was wrong, that maybe Helena was right and I was just being dramatic. But that hope faded the night I caught Lucas sneaking into the garage at 2 in the morning, carrying a black duffel bag and whispering into his phone. I stayed quiet behind the door, listened to his conversation. He mentioned the product, the usual spot and keeping it in the car. My car. That was when I knew this wasn't teenage rebellion. This was serious. This was criminal. And if I didn't act, it was only a matter of time before it all blew up in our faces. That Saturday morning started like any other. I was in the backyard polishing the old red Chevy I'd had for over 20 years. That truck had carried bricks, cement, groceries, and even a few crying grandchildren. I took pride in keeping it clean, even if it creaked in every corner. As I wiped down the hood, I noticed something strange, a tiny plastic bag stuck beneath the driver's seat. My heart skipped a beat. It was hidden just out of sight, as if someone had deliberately placed it there. I picked it up, and inside was a small amount of white powder. My hands trembled. I knew exactly what it was. I didn't want to believe it. My first instinct was denial. Maybe it had fallen in by accident. Maybe someone dropped it. But my house was locked, and only a handful of people had access to the truck. I tried to calm down, thinking of logical explanations. Still, a knot tightened in my chest. I brought the bag inside, set it on the kitchen table, and stared at it for what felt like an hour. I didn't want to call the police. I wasn't ready to accuse anyone without proof. But something told me this wasn't random. Someone had put it there, and I needed to find out who. I waited until dinner, hoping someone would slip up. Maybe mention something odd. Helena had gone to visit a friend, and that left just me and Lucas. We sat at the table in silence, eating beans and rice like we always did. He was unusually quiet, barely touched his food, and avoided my eyes. That was the first time I really noticed something off. My grandson, the boy I once carried on my shoulders, was hiding something. I could feel it in my bones, the same bones that had laid the foundation of every house I'd ever built. I asked him casually if he'd had anyone in the truck lately. He shrugged, said no, and quickly changed the subject to school. But I wasn't convinced. The lie was too smooth, too practiced. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the little bag still sitting in the drawer by the table. My mind kept going in circles. What was Lucas involved in? Had Helena seen anything strange? Why hadn't she said something, or worse, was she turning a blind eye? I didn't want to believe it, but the seed of doubt had already taken root. By morning, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to let this go, not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I couldn't bear the weight of silence. I had spent my life telling the truth, and I wasn't going to start lying to protect someone from consequences, especially not someone I loved. I decided to talk to Helena, show her what I found, and pray that she would help me find the right path forward. But I had no idea that this choice would lead to a betrayal that would nearly destroy everything I held dear. When I finally sat Helena down at the kitchen table, I placed the small plastic bag between us without saying a word. She looked at it, then at me, eyebrows furrowing in confusion, or maybe fear. "What is this, Dad?" she asked, already knowing the answer. I didn't raise my voice. I simply told her where I found it and how. I explained every detail, from the way it was tucked beneath the seat to Lucas's strange behavior at dinner. I waited for her to absorb it, hoping she'd react with concern. Instead, she sighed, not in relief, but in frustration. "Lucas would never," she began, but I cut her off. "Helena, I know what I saw. I'm not accusing him blindly. I just want to get to the bottom of this before it gets worse." She crossed her arms, eyes narrowing. "You think I'm a bad mother now?" she snapped. That wasn't what I had said, but the wall was already going up. She wasn't listening with her heart, only her pride. The argument escalated quickly. She said I was overreacting, that maybe someone else had used the truck. She clung to every other possibility, rather than face what might be the truth. I told her I wasn't angry, just scared. Scared of what her son might be getting into, and of what would happen if we ignored the signs. But to her, my concern sounded like blame. That's when she said it. "If you take this to the police, you'll destroy this family." And that broke me. I stood there staring at the woman I had raised, the little girl I carried home from school when she scraped her knee, now defending the very thing that could ruin her son's future. "I'm not the one destroying anything," I said quietly. "Whatever happens next depends on Lucas and you." Then I left the room. I didn't slam the door. I didn't yell. I just walked away, feeling more alone in that moment than I had in years. That night, I couldn't eat. I paced the living room, waiting for some miracle. Maybe Lucas would confess, maybe Helena would reconsider. But nothing came, only silence. The kind of silence that settles in a house after trust has been broken. I knew then that I had a choice to make. Protect my grandson at the risk of becoming his accomplice, or take the hardest road I'd ever walked and do what was right. And deep down, I already knew which road I'd take. Because doing the right thing, even when it hurts, was all I had left. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. I sat in my old armchair staring out the window as the first light painted the street in gold. My coffee had gone cold in my hand, untouched. My mind was racing, replaying the conversation with Helena over and over. I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal, not just from my grandson, but from my daughter. I raised her to be strong, honest and fair, but now she was blind to the danger right in front of her. I didn't blame her entirely. Love can make us foolish, but I also couldn't let that blind love destroy 3 generations of our family. I decided to go to the police station, not to accuse Lucas yet, but to seek advice. I spoke with an officer I trusted, someone I had known from the community for years. I explained the situation, every detail, every hesitation. He listened carefully, and when I finished, he didn't pressure me. He simply said, "You have to decide what kind of man you want to be to your grandson, one who covers up his mistakes or one who teaches him to face the consequences." I thanked him and left, but his words echoed in my mind the entire walk home. That evening, Helena came into the living room with Lucas trailing behind her, his eyes downcast. She had a stern expression, the kind she wore when she knew something unpleasant had to be said. "Lucas has something to tell you," she said sharply. He mumbled a few words, something about friends and just holding it for someone. It was a weak excuse, one I'd heard too many times in my youth from other boys on the wrong path. But the worst part wasn't what he said. It was how Helena looked at me. Not angry, not ashamed, but as if she expected me to just forgive and forget. I told Lucas to sit down. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "You're lucky I'm not calling the police tonight." His lip quivered, but he stayed quiet. "But this doesn't go away because you said sorry. You're not a child anymore. You made a choice. And now you have to make another one. Come with me to the police and explain yourself, or I go alone and file the report." That got his attention. He looked at his mother, panicked, but she said nothing. Her silence was her answer. The next few hours were tense. Helena stormed off, slamming doors, crying, saying I was heartless, but I didn't budge. I wasn't doing this out of anger. I was doing it because I loved them both too much to let this slide. I called the officer from earlier and arranged a meeting for the next day. I told Lucas he had until morning to decide if he'd come willingly. He didn't answer. He just stared at the floor, shaking. But I could see something shifting in him. Fear, maybe, or guilt. Either way, it meant he was finally starting to understand the weight of what he'd done. That night I barely slept. Not from regret, but from sorrow. No grandfather ever dreams of being in this position. I had pictured fishing trips, long talks on the porch, sharing wisdom. Not threats of prison and broken trust, but life doesn't always go the way we hope. Sometimes love means making the hardest choices imaginable, especially when no one else is willing to. That morning came heavy, like a storm hanging low over the rooftops. I heard Lucas moving in the kitchen before I even got up. Rare for a boy who used to sleep in past noon. I took my time getting dressed, buttoning my shirt with slow, careful fingers, like I was preparing for battle. When I entered the room, he was sitting at the table, hands clasped tightly, his eyes red but dry. He looked up at me like he was trying to gauge whether I had softened overnight. I hadn't. But I also hadn't hardened. I was simply a man who had made peace with a painful duty. We sat in silence for a while. No words, just the ticking of the wall clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Finally, I said, "Have you decided?" Lucas nodded slowly. "I'll go," he whispered. It wasn't confident, it wasn't noble, but it was something. I didn't praise him. I didn't offer comfort. I simply said, "Good, we'll leave after breakfast." I poured us both some coffee, his mostly milk, and we sat in that kitchen like two men trying to remember how they ended up in this mess. Helena didn't come out of her room. I could hear her moving around, slamming drawers, occasionally muttering under her breath. She hadn't spoken to me since the night before, and though part of me wanted to go to her, to explain once more that I wasn't trying to ruin her son's life, I knew it wouldn't matter. She wasn't ready to hear it. Maybe she never would be, but I couldn't let her refusal to see reality drag us all into a darker hole. I left a note on the counter, taking Lucas to do the right thing. I hope someday you'll understand. At the police station, the air was colder than usual, sterile and grey. The officer greeted us with a calm nod, took us into a quiet room. Lucas sat down, fidgeting, his voice trembling as he began to talk. I sat beside him, silent, not as a shield, but as a witness. He told them everything. About the friends, the threats, the promise of money, about hiding the stash in my car without thinking of what it would mean if I were the one caught. The officer listened without judgment, taking notes with slow, steady hands. They didn't arrest him, not yet. Because of his age and the fact that it was his first offense, the case would likely go to a diversion program, maybe community service, maybe counseling. They said I had done the right thing by bringing him in. But that didn't make it feel any easier. As we left, Lucas didn't speak. Neither did I. The silence between us was different now. Not tense, just heavy, like we were both carrying something that couldn't be put down. When we returned home, Helena was waiting at the door. Her eyes were red too, but her jaw was tight with anger. "I hope you're happy," she said coldly. "You broke him." I looked at her for a long time before answering. "No," I said. "I might have saved him." That made her flinch. She turned away, muttering that I had no idea what I'd done. But I did. I knew exactly what I'd done. I had chosen to be a man my grandson could eventually respect, not one who turned a blind eye to save face. I had chosen truth over comfort, even if it meant standing alone. Later that night, Lucas knocked on my door. He stood there, awkward, uncertain. "Thanks," he said quietly. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw a kid who'd been forced to grow up in a single week. "Don't thank me yet," I said. "Just don't waste the chance you've been given." He nodded and went back to bed. I sat down at my desk, pulled out a pen, and started writing in the journal I kept since I was a young man. I didn't write about the police or Helena's anger. I wrote about a boy who might still become a good man, and the grandfather who refused to let him fall. Because when you're old, you don't measure your worth by how easy life gets. You measure it by what you stood for, even when no one else would. The following days were quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that hums in your ears and weighs heavy in your chest. Helena stopped talking to me altogether. Not a glance, not a word, not even an acknowledgement when I passed her in the hallway. It was as though I had become a ghost in my own house. Every slam of a door, every clink of a dish felt like a statement. And Lucas, well, he spent most of his time in his room, leaving only for meals. And even then, he ate in silence. I could feel the tension curling through the walls like smoke from a fire no one wanted to admit was still burning. I tried once, just once, to talk to my daughter. I approached her while she was folding laundry, hands moving sharply, rhythmically, like she was trying to beat her anger into the fabric. "Helena," I said softly, "I know you're upset, but someday you'll see this was—" She cut me off with a look that could freeze blood. "Don't," she hissed. "Don't pretend you did this for him. You did it because you couldn't stand losing control." That hurt. deeper than I expected. Not because she was wrong, because she was, but because she believed it. At night, I would sit alone in the living room, looking at old photo albums. There was one picture I kept going back to. Helena, maybe 8 years old, standing in front of a sandcastle we built on the beach, her arms thrown up in triumph, sunburnt cheeks and missing teeth. I remembered that day like it was yesterday, back when we had nothing but time and love and promise ahead of us, back before life taught us to mistrust each other. I wanted so badly to rewind, to remind her of who I'd always been, but there's no rewind button for broken trust. One morning, about a week after we'd taken Lucas to the station, I noticed him outside in the backyard. He was helping an old woman across the street carry groceries to her porch. A small act maybe, but it gave me hope. That's what this was for, I told myself. Those tiny steps, those quiet choices, the things no one claps for. Maybe he was still angry with me. Maybe he didn't understand the full weight of what I'd done, but he was beginning to behave like someone who did. The next time I saw him, I asked if he wanted to help me fix the shed roof. He hesitated, then nodded. We worked for hours under the sun, mostly in silence, but it was a good silence. Not like before. It was the kind of silence men shared when they were trying to make peace, to mend something bigger than wood and nails. At one point, I passed him the hammer and said, "You're stronger than you think." He looked at me, not smiling, but not cold either. "So are you," he said. That was enough. But Helena's anger lingered like smoke after a fire. She watched us from the window, arms crossed, lips pressed thin. I knew she still saw betrayal in my actions, still believed I had put my pride before her son. And maybe nothing I ever said would change her mind. But I also knew that being a father doesn't stop just because your child grows up. And sometimes loving them means being willing to lose them, if that's what it takes to protect what's right. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe Lucas would drift back toward those same friends. Maybe Helena would pack her things and leave. But for now, we were under one roof, breathing the same air, sharing moments that might one day become memories. And that had to count for something. Because in the end, love isn't just about hugs and birthdays and saying, "I'm proud of you." Sometimes love is silence. Sometimes love is consequence. And sometimes love is simply not giving up, even when everyone else has. I couldn't help but replay everything that had led us to this point. Not just the day Lucas hid the drugs in my car, but all the small cracks that formed along the way, the moments I overlooked, the warning signs Helena dismissed, the awkward silences we pretended weren't there. There were times I wondered if I had failed, not just as a father, but as a grandfather too. Maybe I hadn't taught Helena how to recognize discipline as love. Maybe I hadn't shown Lucas enough of what it meant to be a man. But then again, maybe part of growing older is learning to forgive yourself for the things you did wrong, and for the things you didn't know how to do better. That night, while I was sitting on the back steps, nursing a mug of lukewarm coffee, Lucas came out and joined me. He didn't say anything right away, just stared up at the sky like he was searching for something among the stars. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "Grandpa, I didn't think you'd really do it." I didn't ask what it meant. We both knew. I took a slow sip and replied, "Sometimes the hardest thing to do is the right one." He nodded, almost imperceptibly. "I hated you for it," he muttered. "I know," I said, "but I'd rather you hate me now than hate yourself forever." He didn't respond, but he didn't walk away either, and that meant everything. Later, as I got ready for bed, I passed by Helena's room. Her door was open just a crack, enough for me to see her sitting on the edge of her bed, shoulders hunched, eyes red. She was holding a framed photo, our old family picture, taken when Lucas was still a toddler. I wanted to walk in, to say something that could fix the damage, to remind her that everything I did came from a place of love. But I knew better than to force it. So I stood there for a moment, just long enough for her to notice me, and then walked away. Healing would take time, but for the first time in weeks, I believed it was possible. The days that followed were heavy with silence, the kind of silence that doesn't scream, but suffocates slowly. Helena barely spoke to me, only what was necessary. She cooked dinner like always, left my plate on the table, then disappeared into her room. Lucas stayed in his room too, only leaving for school or meals. I didn't push. I'd done what had to be done. Told the police the truth, turned in the drugs, and forced a reckoning none of us were ready for. And yet, in the quiet of those days, I often found myself staring out the window, wondering if I had just permanently shattered the only family I had left. Then, on a Thursday morning, something shifted. I was in the garage fixing a loose hinge on the tool cabinet when I heard Lucas's voice. "Can I help?" I turned around slowly, trying not to show too much surprise. He was standing in the doorway, hands in his hoodie pocket, eyes uncertain. "Sure," I said, stepping aside. For the next half hour, we worked together without saying much. I handed him tools. He held boards steady. It wasn't about the work. It was about the unspoken truth. He was trying to reach back across the line he'd crossed. And I was meeting him halfway, not with words, but with presence. That night, I found Helena in the kitchen, washing dishes with robotic precision. "Helena," I said gently, "I never wanted to hurt you, but Lucas needed someone to tell him no, someone to love him enough to do the hard thing." She didn't look up. "You humiliated him. You humiliated me," she whispered. I nodded. "Maybe I did, but I also may have saved his life." She put the plate down and finally looked at me, eyes raw, tired. "You think this will fix him?" "No," I said quietly, "but maybe it'll wake him up." She stared at me for a long time, then walked away. She didn't agree, but she didn't argue either. That was progress. The following week, the police dropped the investigation. Lucas's cooperation and my testimony helped prove he'd been coerced into holding the drugs for someone else. He got off with community service and mandatory counseling. It wasn't justice in the purest sense, but it was a second chance, and that's all I'd ever hoped for. Watching him clean graffiti off the town hall wall one afternoon, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: cautious pride. He wasn't the boy I used to take fishing, but maybe, just maybe, he was becoming someone better. Still, forgiveness didn't come quickly. One evening, I found an envelope on my nightstand. Inside was a short letter scribbled in Lucas's uneven handwriting. "I was wrong. I don't know if I'll ever make it right, but I want to try. I'm sorry." No grand gestures. No excuses. Just a boy owning his mistake. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, holding that letter, letting the quiet soak in. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't moved, but because something deeper than sadness had taken its place, something like peace. It wasn't over. Helena still held onto her disappointment like armor, and Lucas still walked like he carried a weight he couldn't put down. But our family, broken as it was, had taken its first steps toward healing. And maybe, in the end, that's what love really looks like. Not perfect, not easy, but brave enough to tell the truth, even when it hurts. Weeks passed, and though the dust had settled, the air inside the house still felt thick with old wounds and unsaid words. I kept my routine: morning coffee at 6:30, a walk around the neighborhood, repairs around the house that didn't really need doing but gave me purpose. Lucas had taken his punishment seriously. Every Saturday morning, he left for his community service shift, coming back hours later with blistered hands and a tired look in his eyes. But it was the way he carried himself, less arrogant, more grounded, that caught my attention. The boy who once rolled his eyes at everything now sat quietly at the dinner table, asking about my day, about my work, even about stories from when I was his age. One evening, I caught him flipping through my old photo albums, ones I hadn't touched in years. He stopped at a picture of me and his grandmother, our arms wrapped around each other after I'd finished building our first house. "Was that here?" he asked. I nodded. "Same land, different world." He didn't say anything for a moment, then muttered, "She looked happy." I smiled, a little ache tugging at my chest. She was. She believed in building things that lasted. He closed the album gently. I want to build something like that too. And in that quiet statement, I saw a boy trying to pick up bricks he once threw. Helena, on the other hand, was a different story. She still avoided long conversations with me, and when we did speak, her words were clipped, guarded. I knew she blamed me, not just for Lucas, but for how I'd challenged the way she raised him, and maybe she wasn't wrong. I hadn't always been gentle in my delivery. I came from a time when tough love was the only kind we knew. But every time I saw the way Lucas was slowly changing, every time I saw him choosing responsibility over rebellion, I felt justified in my choice, even if it cost me my daughter's trust. That rift between us hurt more than I admitted. I'd raised Helena with everything I had, given her every tool I could to build a good life, and now, here we were, two stubborn generations staring at each other from across a chasm of misunderstanding. But I didn't push her. Instead, I showed up. I fixed her leaky faucet. I made her tea when she had a headache. I bought her favorite bread from the bakery on Thursdays. I didn't say much, but every gesture was a sentence I couldn't bring myself to speak aloud. I'm still your father. I still love you. I'm still here. Then, one Sunday afternoon, something shifted. We were all outside. Lucas was painting the shed for his last service project. I was trimming the hedges. Helena came out with lemonade. She didn't say a word, just handed me a glass. Our fingers brushed and she looked at me. Not with anger, not with pain, but with a softness I hadn't seen in months. "Thanks," I said, barely above a whisper. She nodded. "You were right," she murmured, then turned and walked back inside. It wasn't an apology, but it didn't need to be. Sometimes healing comes not in dramatic confessions, but in small, shared moments under a quiet sun. Later that night, Lucas sat beside me on the porch. "You think Mom will ever forgive me?" he asked. I looked at him, this boy who had made so many mistakes and yet was brave enough to face them. "She already has," I said. "She just doesn't know how to say it yet." He nodded, then leaned back and stared at the stars. "Thanks for not giving up on me." I didn't respond right away. I just looked out into the darkness, feeling something in my chest finally unclench. "That's what family does, kid," I said. "We hold the line when no one else will." And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were finally finding our way back. A few weeks later, while sorting through an old box of receipts and utility bills in the attic, I came across something I hadn't seen in years, a letter from my late wife. The envelope was yellowed and worn, her handwriting a little faded, but unmistakably hers. I remembered tucking it away after she passed, unable to read it then. My hands trembled as I opened it now. She had written it during her final days, a goodbye I hadn't had the courage to face back then. As I sat on the floor, sunlight filtering through the attic window, I began to read. Her words were gentle, wise, and full of the kind of love only time can forge. She spoke about raising Helena, about how proud she was of the woman she had become, and how much she trusted me to guide her through life, even if it meant making difficult choices. She wrote about Lucas, though he was just a baby when she passed, and said she knew he would challenge me, just as Helena once did. But her final lines struck me deepest. "When they forget who they are, remind them. And when they forget who you are, remind them too. With love, not pride. With patience, not silence." I sat there a long time, tears in my eyes, her voice echoing in my heart. That letter became a turning point. I knew I couldn't keep waiting for Helena to come to me. I had to be the one to open the door. That evening, I invited her to sit with me on the porch, just the two of us. It was awkward at first. Two people used to circling each other, suddenly forced to face the same direction. I handed her the letter. "Your mother wrote this," I said. "I think it's time you heard her voice again." She read it slowly, her eyes scanning each word as if afraid to blink. When she finished, she didn't speak. She just clutched the paper to her chest, and for the first time since this all began, she let herself cry. We talked late into the night after that, really talked, about the choices she made, the regrets we both carried, and the ways we'd failed each other without meaning to. I told her I was proud of her for raising a child on her own, for standing firm even when we disagreed. And she told me that deep down, she always knew I was only trying to help. She had just been afraid of losing control, of losing her son, and of admitting that maybe her father still had a few lessons worth learning. That conversation didn't fix everything, but it planted something new, a seed of forgiveness, watered by truth and shared pain. In the days that followed, the tension in the house softened. Helena and Lucas spoke more openly. I noticed her correcting him, but with a gentler tone. He began helping around the house without being asked. And for the first time, it didn't feel like we were three people just surviving in the same space. It felt like a family again. One Sunday morning, as we sat around the table having breakfast, Helena looked up from her coffee and said, "Dad, I think Mom would be proud of you." I looked at her, and for a moment, I saw the little girl I once held in my arms, the one who used to think I could fix anything. I smiled, my voice thick with emotion. I hope so. I really hope so. And as the sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, warming the faces of my daughter and grandson, I realized we were healing, not because we'd forgotten the past, but because we had finally chosen to carry it together. The peace in the house didn't erase the damage that had been done. Though Helena and I were rebuilding our bond, Lucas remained guarded. He still avoided eye contact, spoke in clipped phrases, and flinched every time I entered the room. I knew trust wasn't something I could demand. It had to be earned. But I also knew that if I didn't confront him soon, he would carry that guilt like a weight for the rest of his life. One quiet afternoon, while Helena was out, I found Lucas in the backyard, pretending to rake leaves. I walked up slowly and said, "We need to talk, you and I. No yelling, just truth." At first, he didn't respond. He kept his back turned, gripping the rake so hard his knuckles turned white. "There's nothing to talk about," he muttered. "It's over." I stepped beside him, my voice low and steady. "No, it's not. Not until we face it. You know what you did, and I know why you did it. But you need to hear it from me. You hurt this family. You hurt your mother, and you nearly destroyed the only good thing we had left between us." His eyes welled up, but he blinked the tears away. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know who else to turn to. Those guys, they said it was just temporary, that I could make quick money and get out. I didn't think they'd actually use your truck." That was the first time he admitted it aloud. The weight of it seemed to crush him. I nodded slowly. "And when the police came, you let me take the fall. You stood there and said nothing while your mother looked at me like I was a criminal. That was the part that broke me, Lucas. Not the drugs, not the betrayal, but the silence." He dropped the rake and sat on the steps, burying his face in his hands. I was scared. I thought if I confessed, she'd hate me forever. I thought I could fix it before it got worse. I sat beside him, not touching, just near enough for him to feel my presence. "But you didn't fix it. You made it worse, and the only way to stop the bleeding is to face the pain." I gave him the choice. You can continue hiding, pretending this will all fade, or you can step up, be the man your mother believes you are, and tell the truth. He looked at me, eyes red and tired. "Do you think she could ever forgive me?" I paused, choosing my words carefully. "That's not my answer to give. But I can tell you this, she loves you more than you understand. And forgiveness doesn't begin when someone says sorry. It begins when they start acting like they mean it." He nodded slowly, a silent agreement hanging in the air between us. It wasn't resolution, but it was the first honest step forward he'd taken in months. That evening, Lucas asked to speak to his mother. He didn't want me in the room, and I respected that. I watched from the hallway as he closed the door behind them. Their voices were muffled, occasionally sharp, but mostly soft. After nearly an hour, the door opened again. Helena stepped out, face pale and eyes swollen, but there was no fury, only a quiet sort of exhaustion. Lucas followed, his head down, hands shaking. "He told me," she said simply. Everything. I nodded. And? She looked between us. We have a long road ahead, but I'd rather walk it together than alone. That night, something shifted in Lucas. He offered to help cook dinner. He cleared the table. He even sat beside me on the couch to watch an old movie, something he hadn't done in years. I didn't pretend everything was fine, but I let myself hope again. And in that moment, hope felt heavier than pain, but far more valuable. Maybe, just maybe, we were becoming something more than survivors. Maybe we were becoming a family worth saving. The weeks that followed were a slow march toward healing. Nothing dramatic happened. No grand confessions, no teary public reconciliations. Just quiet mornings, shared meals, and awkward conversations that gradually grew warmer. Lucas started going back to school part-time at first. He met with a counselor regularly, something he chose on his own. Every time he walked through the front door after those sessions, I saw a little less burden in his eyes. I didn't ask what they discussed. I figured that was for him to process, but I made it clear I was there if he ever wanted to talk. Helena, too, was different. She wasn't as quick to defend Lucas as she used to be, but she also wasn't cruel. She found a middle ground, the space between love and accountability where real parenting lives. One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, she said softly, "I think I wanted so badly for him to have a better life than I did, that I forgot to teach him how to take responsibility for it." I placed the last plate in the cupboard and looked at her. We all mess up, but what matters is what we do after, and you're doing it right now. At that, I had resumed some handyman jobs in the neighborhood, just enough to keep busy. People I'd known for years would smile and ask how I was holding up. Some had heard rumors about the incident with the police, but none of them brought it up directly. It didn't matter. I held my head high. I had nothing to be ashamed of. If anything, I'd come out of that storm with a clearer sense of who I was and what I meant to this family. I still woke up early, made strong coffee, and sat by the window with my newspaper, same as always. But now, Lucas would occasionally join me, sipping his own cup in silence. It was a new kind of ritual, and I cherished it more than I ever expected. One afternoon, I noticed a change in Lucas's demeanor. He came home wearing a pressed shirt and holding a folder under his arm. At first, I thought it was just another school project, but he sat down beside me and opened it without a word. Inside were application forms for a vocational training program in electrical work. "I want to build something real," he said, "not just for me, but for Mom, for you. I want to make up for everything I messed up." I looked at the forms, then at him, and smiled. "Then start here. Start with this. You don't owe us perfection, just effort." That night at dinner, Lucas told Helena about his decision. She didn't cry or make a big speech. She simply reached across the table, took his hand and said, "I'm proud of you." And for the first time in a long while, I saw him believe it. He sat straighter, looked her in the eye, and nodded with quiet strength. There was something in his posture that reminded me of his father, the good parts, the strong parts, and I realized then that maybe we hadn't lost everything after all. Maybe we had just been given the chance to rebuild. Helena and I began speaking more openly too. She apologized for the things she said during the investigation. I forgave her without hesitation. "You were scared for your son," I told her, "and I was scared of losing my daughter." That simple truth hung in the air, healing what remained unspoken. We both cried a little, hugged tightly, and promised never to let silence grow between us again. Families don't stay strong by pretending nothing's wrong. They grow stronger by facing what hurts together. Lucas's program started the following month. He asked me to drive him on the first day, and I did so with pride. We didn't say much during the ride, but as he stepped out of the car, he turned back and said, "Thanks, Vo, for not giving up on me." I nodded, holding back tears. "Just keep going forward, boy. That's all I ask." Watching him walk into that building, shoulders squared, future ahead, it felt like closing a long, painful chapter and opening a new one. when we'd write together, one page at a time. Spring came early that year, carrying with it the scent of renewal, but with the changing season also came a familiar unease, a knock at the door one morning that sent Helena into a panic. A man stood outside wearing a suit, badge clipped to his belt, polite but serious. He was a federal investigator, following up on a lead related to the drug ring Lucas had once been caught up in. Though Lucas had served his sentence and cooperated with the authorities, some loose ends remained, names left out of reports, and a suspicion that he had held something back to protect someone else. My heart sank as I listened. We thought we had buried that chapter, but the past has a way of clawing back to the surface. Lucas, now a few months into his training program, came home that evening to find his mother in tears and me pacing the kitchen like a caged animal. We told him everything. His face paled, not with guilt, but with fear. "I didn't lie," he said, "but I didn't tell them everything either." He admitted that one of the dealers he knew back then, a man named Teo, had been the one to stash the drugs in my car. Lucas had taken the fall, thinking that silence was loyalty. He hadn't expected things to spiral as they did. Now, the man was still out there, and worse, he knew Lucas had cooperated during the investigation. I felt anger rise in me again, at the world, at Lucas, and even at myself. Had we learned nothing? But this time, something in me shifted. Instead of shouting, I sat down, folded my hands and said, "You're going to make it right. Not for me, not for your mother, for you." And he nodded. The next day, with trembling hands, Lucas went back to the authorities and gave them every detail. Addresses, names, old burner phone numbers he still remembered. It was his decision, and he knew what it might cost him, but it was also his liberation. He was cutting the last thread tying him to that life, and doing so as a man. The days that followed were tense. We received a call that Teo had been arrested. Lucas was called in again to give an official statement. No charges would come back to him. He had already paid for his silence, but the officers made it clear he had done the right thing, and the timing had helped them stop something much bigger than we'd ever imagined. When Lucas came home that night, there was no celebration, just relief. A long, tight hug with his mother, a quiet nod from me, a shared meal that tasted more like peace than food. And later, as we stood on the porch watching the sun dip behind the hills, Lucas said, "I finally feel like I'm standing on solid ground." That night, Helena found an old photo album buried in a box in the attic. It was filled with pictures of her childhood, of me in my younger days, of her mother, smiling, alive, laughing. We hadn't looked through it in years. As we turned the pages, we talked about who we used to be and who we were now. We were bruised, yes, but not broken. Lucas leaned over our shoulders, studying the photos, learning stories he'd never heard. "I want to be in the next album," he said. "Not the one people hide away, the one they keep on the coffee table." And in that moment, I knew we weren't just surviving anymore. We were living again. Weeks passed after Lucas's final visit to the authorities, and for the first time in years, the house felt light. Not empty, but unburdened. The tension that had once lingered in every corner, that unspoken fear that things could collapse again, had dissipated like dust swept out the front door. Lucas kept himself busy, working long days and coming home exhausted but satisfied. He had found part-time work helping at a local auto shop while finishing his training. The same hands that once hid secrets were now fixing engines, tightening bolts, and shaking the hands of old men who called him kid with a kind smile instead of suspicion. But the truest transformation wasn't in his job or his haircut or the way he carried himself now. It was in how he treated us. Every morning Lucas would make coffee before I was even out of bed, a gesture that seemed small but meant the world to me. He spoke to his mother with a gentleness that reminded me of her younger self, back when she still believed life was simple and kind. He asked questions, he listened, and he stayed, even when the conversations got heavy. One night, after dinner, he looked at me and said, Grandpa, I never asked, but how did you feel that day, when they almost arrested you? I paused, unsure how to answer. Then I simply said, I felt like I failed you. Lucas didn't flinch. He reached across the table, placed a firm hand on mine and replied, No, you saved me. You were the only one who ever told me the truth. That moment cracked something inside me, not in a painful way, but in the way a wall cracks to let light in. For years I had carried guilt, anger, and the bitter ache of betrayal, but now, sitting there with him, I felt something better, peace. I had raised my daughter alone, buried my wife too young, and nearly lost my grandson to the streets. But somehow, through it all, we had returned to each other. Helena, too, began to change. She apologized to me one evening, tears in her eyes, voice shaking. I was so afraid of losing him that I stopped seeing what he was becoming, she confessed. I didn't scold her, I didn't say I told you so. I just pulled her close and said, we did our best, now we do better. From that point on, we rebuilt not just our family, but our trust. We talked more about her job, about my old construction stories, about Lucas's dreams. We made space for laughter again. We even had neighbors over for a barbecue, the first in years. People smiled at Lucas, shook his hand, treated him like one of their own. No one whispered anymore. One morning, as I tended to my small backyard garden, Lucas stepped outside with 2 cups of coffee. He handed me one and said, I was thinking maybe we could build something out back, a workshop or a shed. You and me. I looked at him, surprised. You want to build with the old man now? I teased. He laughed and nodded. Yeah, I think I finally earned the right. And just like that, we began again, board by board, step by step, side by side. The shed we built that summer still stands behind the house. Not because it's the most beautiful or the most useful thing I've ever built. Lord knows I've put up churches, bridges, even a town hall back in my youth. But because it was the first thing Lucas and I built together. He handled the saw like a man who'd never touched one before, but by the 3rd week, his hands moved with confidence. Each hammer swing, each aligned plank felt like redemption taking form. Sometimes we didn't even talk, just worked. And in those silences, I found more healing than I ever had in all the sermons and advice people threw at me during the hard years. The town eventually moved on from the scandal. The same neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid me began waving again. Some even stopped by for coffee, curious to see the boy they'd once judged so harshly now, sanding a workbench with his grandfather. We were no longer the story people whispered at the market. We became something else. Proof that things broken could be repaired, that blood ties could fray and still be mended. My daughter, Helena, visited often now. She no longer flinched when Lucas entered the room. She laughed more, even cooked with us on Sundays. The boy she had defended blindly was now the man she leaned on with pride. And me, I forgave myself. It wasn't easy. The night I sat on that jail bench, heart pounding as the officer questioned me, I thought I had reached the end. But it turned out to be the beginning of something harder and more beautiful than I imagined. I didn't just save Lucas from a path that would have ruined him. I saved myself from a silence that had settled too deep for too long. I learned that being right doesn't always feel good, but being true to your values always pays off in the long run, even when it costs you love for a time. Now, when people ask me if I ever regret turning my own grandson in, I tell them this. I didn't turn him in. I turned him around. Lucas still carries that day with him. I see it in his eyes, but he doesn't carry it like shame. He carries it like a scar you respect, like a lesson carved into your skin. And he's grateful, not just for what I did, but for the man I remained through it all. Some mornings he calls me just to ask how I'm doing, like clockwork. Morning, Grandpa. Need anything today? I always say no, but sometimes I let him come anyway. He brings donuts, fixes the creaky screen door, or just sits on the porch with me sipping coffee. And in those quiet moments, I realize something. I didn't just get my grandson back. I got a second chance to be a father, a better one. And maybe, just maybe, that's what life is all about. Not avoiding the pain, but building again after it passes. Stronger, wiser, together. Sometimes life doesn't give you the story you expected. It hands you a mess and dares you to find meaning in it. I never imagined I'd one day have to choose between protecting my grandson and standing up for what's right. But I made my choice. And through all the pain, silence, and tears, something extraordinary happened. Love returned, not as comfort, but as strength. This story isn't about betrayal. It's about courage. It's about a man who refused to stay silent, a boy who found his way back, and a family that learned to rebuild, not from perfection, but from truth. So if you ever find yourself in the middle of a storm, unsure of what to do, remember, doing the right thing might cost you today, but it builds a foundation for tomorrow, because sometimes the most painful decisions are the ones that heal generations. And that's what this old man learned, not in books, not in sermons, but in the quiet, hard-earned moments that follow a broken heart.